He paid for the seat. He earned the status. And yet, in front of silent cabin, a black CEO was told he didn't belong in first class. Forced to stand, questioned, and quietly pushed aside for someone else. No explanation. No apology. Just a moment that felt all too familiar and impossible to ignore. But what no one on that flight knew was that the man they humiliated wasn't just another passenger. Within hours, a single decision would shake an entire airline to its core. The question is, how did they not see it coming? He wasn't just another passenger boarding that flight. He was a man who had spent years building a reputation that most people could only dream of. From long nights in small offices to high-stakes boardrooms, he had climbed his way to the top, becoming a respected CEO known for discipline, vision, and quiet authority. Every decision he made carried weight, every move calculated, every success earned the hard way. That morning it started like any other. A tight schedule, an important meeting waiting on the other side of the country, and just enough time to catch a flight that would keep everything on track. First class wasn't a luxury to him. It was a necessity. Time mattered, focus mattered, and he had paid for both. As he stepped into the airport, everything felt routine. The polished floors, the distant announcements, the steady rhythm of travelers moving with purpose. It was a world he knew well. No attention, no spotlight, just another professional moving through another busy day. But even in familiar places, some moments don't follow the script. A glance that lingers too long, a tone that feels slightly off, a hesitation that doesn't quite make sense. At first, it was easy to ignore. After all, he had learned to move past small things, to stay focused, to not let distractions pull him off course. But sometimes those small moments aren't small at all. Sometimes they're the beginning of something much bigger. And by the time he reached the gate, something in the air had already begun to shift. Quietly, subtly, but undeniably. At first, it was subtle, so subtle it could almost be dismissed. A pause at the check-in counter that lasted just a second too long. A glance at his boarding pass, then back at him, as if something didn't quite add up. The smile he was used to receiving never came. Instead, there was a quiet stiffness, a formality that felt colder than usual. Still, he moved forward. He had places to be, responsibilities waiting. He wasn't going to let a moment of discomfort slow him down. But as boarding began, that feeling followed him. Passengers were welcomed with ease, their tickets scanned without question. But when it was his turn, the rhythm broke. The agent hesitated again, scanning his pass twice, then calling someone over. No clear explanation, just a quiet exchange, voices low enough to avoid attention, but not low enough to hide the tension. Eyes began to turn. He stood there composed, saying nothing. Years of experience had taught him how to hold his ground without making a scene. But inside, something was shifting. This wasn't routine anymore. When he finally stepped onto the plane, it should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. As he made his way to first class, the atmosphere changed again. A flight attendant intercepted him before he could even reach his seat. Polite but firm. Her eyes briefly scanned him, then his ticket, then back to him again, like she was searching for something that didn't match. Another pause, another moment that stretched too long. Then came the request. Not loud enough to cause a scene, but clear enough to stop him in his tracks. A suggestion that there might be some kind of mistake, that perhaps he was in the wrong section. Maybe his seat was somewhere else. He looked at the ticket. First class, exactly where he belonged. Around him, passengers were settling in, but now they were watching. Some curious, some uncomfortable. No one is speaking. The situation tightened. Another staff member approached, then another. The tone shifted from uncertainty to quiet authority. What started as a question was slowly becoming a decision, one that didn't include him. And just like that, the unthinkable happened. He was asked to step aside, not because of an error, not because of overbooking, but because, somehow, his presence itself had become the problem. The silence in the cabin grew heavier. Every second stretched longer than the last. He could feel the weight of every eye, every assumption hanging in the air. But what no one realized was that they weren't just removing a passenger. They were making a mistake that would follow them far beyond this flight. And within hours, that quiet moment of humiliation was about to turn into something none of them were prepared for. The moment didn't explode, it collapsed. In a cabin designed for comfort and quiet privilege, everything slowed to a suffocating stillness as he stood there, no longer a passenger, but a problem to be managed. The flight attendant's voice remained controlled, but the message was no longer a suggestion. It was final. He needed to leave the seat. Now, no explanation made sense. No policy is clearly stated. Just a quiet insistence backed by authority and the unspoken assumption that he didn't belong. For a brief second, he didn't move. Not out of confusion, but disbelief. Years of discipline, of building something from nothing, of earning his place in rooms exactly like this. And yet here he was, reduced to a question mark in a space he had already paid for. Around him, no one intervened. No one questioned it. The silence wasn't neutral. It was an agreement. And then, slowly he stood, not defeated, not broken, but fully aware. Every step he took away from that seat carried more than just humiliation. It carried clarity. This wasn't a mistake. This was a decision. And decisions have consequences. As he reached the front of the cabin, the final blow came quietly. A staff member took his boarding pass, glanced at it, and without meeting his eyes, redirected him out of first class completely, as if the matter had already been settled long before he ever stepped onto that plane. That was the moment everything changed, because while they saw a passenger, they could remove. They failed to recognize the man who had the power to remove far more. And as he stepped off that aircraft, one thought settled in, cold, precise, and unavoidable. They had just made the most expensive mistake of their careers. The story didn't end on that runway. It followed him long after the aircraft disappeared into the sky. By the time he reached his destination on a later flight, the humiliation had already transformed into something colder and more deliberate. He returned to what he knew best: numbers, contracts, and decisions that shaped entire companies. Unlike the chaos of that cabin, this was a world where he held control, where respect was written into every agreement, and every signature carried weight. And that was when the airline finally began to understand who they had removed from first class. Meetings were requested. Emails were sent with a sudden urgency that hadn't existed hours before. The same organization that had treated him as disposable was now scrambling to contain the fallout. Because the man they had dismissed wasn't just a passenger. He was the executive overseeing a massive corporate travel budget, one worth hundreds of millions. Within days, that budget was frozen, contracts were suspended, and competitors were quietly contacted. What had been a quiet moment of discrimination inside a plane had now become a boardroom crisis. But for him, it was never just about revenge. The money, the power, the corporate consequences, those were simply the language the airline understood. What stayed with him most was the memory of standing there, surrounded by people who said nothing, watching a situation unfold that they all knew wasn't right. That silence was the real problem, because this wasn't a rare incident. It was a pattern, one that countless others experienced without ever having the resources or influence to push back. He had been able to respond in a way most victims never could, but the injustice itself was something far too many people understood. In the end, the airline issued statements, reviewed policies, and promised change. But policies can be rewritten faster than mindsets. And that leaves a question that goes far beyond one flight, one company, or one man's decision. If someone with power and status can be treated this way in plain sight, what happens to those who don't have either? And how many more stories like this are still going unheard,